Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kılıç Kanat. I'm the research director at SETA Foundation here in Washington, D.C. And today we have a panel on Trump's recent maximum pressure campaign on Iran. Actually, it wasn't recent. It was one of the most significant and I think the consistent foreign policy agendas that President Trump and his administration had so far. And we have four panelists today to discuss different dimensions of the recent decision of the U.S. administration to eliminate the waivers for 8 countries in regards to oil imports from Iran. We have Barbara Slavin, the director of the Future of Iran Initiative from Atlantic Council. We have Mike Doran, senior fellow from Hudson Institute. Kadir Üstün, Executive Director of the SETA Foundation, and Ali Vaz, the Iran Project Director of International Crisis Group. And today we will start with Barbara. And Barbara, if you can give us an overview of what happened and what does this recent decision mean? What can be the possible repercussions of this decision?
Sure. First, thanks, SETA, for inviting me once again to speak here. It's always a pleasure to come here. I think people were a little bit surprised, expected that there would be waivers of some sort, that perhaps for reduced amounts of oil. And this goal of going to zero and of giving no waivers did come as a bit of a shock. And we saw the price of oil jumped for a bit. And it's still, I would argue, probably $10 or $15 a barrel higher than it would have been if we had never had this policy toward Iran. The impact of it, well, clearly beyond higher prices, is that Iran is under tremendous pressure. Its economy is contracting already by nearly 4%. It's probably going to contract by another 6% over the next year. Higher unemployment, very high inflation, collapse of the currency. I think the main impact has been to further immiserate the Iranian people. So the question comes, what is the strategy? What is the goal? Maybe Mike can enlighten us, because I fail to see the strategy. I fail to see a realistic goal. The Trump administration has combined this economic pressure with flirting with regime change. Constant criticism of Iran for human rights abuses, and hardly a mention of anyone else in the region. Meetings between Secretary of State Pompeo and Iranian opposition figures, Iranian diaspora, constantly making threats against the stability of the Islamic Republic. So if you want to negotiate a new agreement, how can you do that if what you're saying is that essentially this regime must go for that to be possible? That's why I've called this policy cruel and counterproductive. It's cruel because the main victims are ordinary people, and it's counterproductive because it's not going to produce a dramatic change in Iran's regional posture. If anything, Iran may become more aggressive and more belligerent. And one thing I think all of us are concerned about is, will the JCPOA be able to survive? So far, Iran has met its commitments under this nuclear agreement. But if it's not benefiting, if it's not getting oil revenues, which it needs, why should it continue to abide by these restrictions? And could we begin to see, if not an outright withdrawal from the deal, some cheating around the edges, shall we say, a few more centrifuges here or there? A little more low-enriched uranium than what has been specified, a kind of calling of President Trump's bluff. What are you going to do now? I mean, we have seen the maximum pressure, so what else is there that the administration can do short of military action, which I don't think President Trump wants? The other thing we've seen, of course, is from Javad Zarif, the foreign minister who was in New York last week, who tried to appeal over the heads of John Bolton, the B team, as he called it, John Bolton, Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, and Mohammed bin Zayed, Iran's adversaries, to President Trump saying, look, do you want to negotiate? We'll negotiate, but you have to be reasonable. You can't listen to these people who are trying to drag the United States into another war. So that's sort of where we are now, and it's not a great place to be in.
What do you think will be the potential impacts of this for the regime's survival?
Well, I think the regime will survive. I mean, it's survived for 40 years under extremely adverse conditions, including a horrible war with Iraq. It's been under sanctions of one sort or another pretty much since 1979, although these are particularly severe. I think that we'll see an effort to sort of rally Iranians around the flag, to make people more nationalistic, perhaps. The US will be less popular. It's traditionally been quite popular in the country. And they'll get through it. And they also know, by the way, that almost every Democratic candidate for president has said that they would return to the JCPOA if elected. So, it's a matter of waiting at least until our 2020 elections. If Trump is reelected, I think Iran will have to recalibrate and negotiate. But I think it can survive until then and just tighten its belt.
And do you think last year during the demonstrations in Iran, Iranian regional policies became an issue? So we see some protests that, like the people protesting that the government is spending money on Syria and other places instead of Iran. Do you think the worsening economic condition would create a reaction among the Iranian public to the Iranian foreign policy?
I think Iranian foreign policy is broadly unpopular in the country and has been for some time. I mean, these slogans are not new. We saw in 2009 the slogan, no to Lebanon, no to Hamas, my life only for Iran was one of the slogans. Most Iranians do not care about the Palestinian cause, and particularly with many Arab states cozying up to Israel, I think many Iranians don't understand why their government has to be more pro-Palestinian than Saudi Arabia, say. So, this has been a constant. It probably will get worse, but ordinary Iranians don't control their country's military interventions. That's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and I don't see any sign that, that they're pulling back from Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq.
Thank you. And Mike, what will be do you think the U.S. policy? So Barbara is saying that she doesn't see any strategy. Do you think the administration has a strategy, and what should be the strategy if there is none?
Sure. I think there is a strategy. It's a containment strategy, and it's an attempt to in a second, I'm going to contradict what I'm saying, but let me start with an idea, and then I'll contradict myself in a moment. The idea is to reverse the Obama outreach to Iran. President Obama sold the outreach to the American people as a narrow arms control agreement, but that's not what it was. It was Obama had a very clear regional strategy, which was to create a kind of concert system that included the Iranians and the Russians, together with the United States and its traditional allies, the Europeans, the Israelis, the Saudis. The Obama concept was that the vital interests of the United States were in the Middle East were rather limited, and that the interests of the Islamic Republic did not run counter to the vital interests of the United States. And if we showed the Iranians that we were willing to work with them on issues of, say, regional stability, defeating Sunni extremism, and so on, then we could reach an accommodation with them. Maybe they wouldn't become partners, but we could at least come to an accommodation. And that was the thinking that started with the moment Obama took office. He wanted to pull the troops out of Iraq. He wanted to go down in history as the president who ended George W. Bush's war in Iraq. And that the pullout from Iraq was based on the notion that a deal could be cut with the Iranians. And that wasn't simply Obama's idea. That was That was the concept, if you remember, that was embedded in the Baker-Hamilton report in 2006.
Yeah.
It was the foreign policy elite's criticism of George W. Bush, right? Was that it was too hostile to Iran, too hostile to Syria, even too hostile to Russia. That's why we had a Russian reset. And if we work with all these powers, we can stabilize the Middle East and pull back from the Middle East. So Trump, there's a continuity between Obama to Trump in that Trump also wants to keep the Middle East at arm's length. But Trump realizes that he's in a geostrategic competition with Iran and to a certain extent with Russia. And at the same time that he doesn't want to deploy U.S. troops on the ground, somebody has to work to contain the Iranians. And so Trump is looking to the traditional allies, the traditional allies of the United States, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey. So he's trying to work to find a new accommodation with the Turks, at the same time working closely with supporting the Israeli efforts against the Iranians in Syria, and working to shield Mohammed bin Salman from all the criticisms that are coming from the Democrats. So it's a containment strategy, as simple as that. And the greatest tool that the U.S. has, since it's reluctant to use its troops, is the economic sanctions. But I think it's wrong to call what we have a maximum pressure campaign. We have a maximum pressure rhetoric backed up by some very real actions, but it has yet to come anywhere close to maximum pressure, either in the economic sphere or in the or in terms of the effort to contain Iran on the ground. And there's a debate within the administration about how far and how fast to go toward maximum pressure. And it's a debate that pits the White House against the State Department. State Department, traditionally, as it always is more concerned about relations with allies, especially the European allies who are trying to keep elements of the JCPOA alive. So there's, they're saying right now, taking no waivers, taking it to zero, but behind the scenes, the creative minds of the State Department and the Europeans are going to work. So there are all kinds of ideas that are being floated about, okay, well, first of all, what kind of waivers are we talking about? Are we talking about waivers to buy oil, or are we talking about waivers to deliver oil? So maybe we're going to take the waivers to buy oil to zero, but delivery can still happen. So then we have ideas about maybe paying a lot of money up front for Iranian oil, and then the deliveries can go on for some time, and so on. So the maximum pressure camp wants to say no. No waivers means no waivers, and the State Department is trying to find creative ways to make countries that are reliant on, especially to make countries that are reliant on Iranian oil, like Turkey, like India, and so on, to give them more breathing room. And then in the nuclear area, you also have waivers that are being given. There are the administration is giving waivers for nuclear work that's being done under the framework of the JCPOA. So if there's a debate on that level too between those who say the goal is to reverse Obama's policy, that means reverse the JCPOA, that means no nuclear work by the Iranians, and those that are saying, well, as long as we keep it alive within within reasonable civil nuclear limits, that's okay. So in a sense, what it is the State Department would represent those who want to say we want to fix the deal, whereas the maximum pressure people say we want to nix the deal completely and build something new later on.
So in terms of rhetoric, we hear couple different things. So what is the objective here? Is objective to permanently stop the nuclear program of Iran? Is the objective to stop the Iranian regional policies, especially in terms of Hezbollah or the Quds Force or in Yemen, other places? Or is the final goal somehow overthrowing the regime? which sounds much more represents actually the Trump administration policy on you.
I think you would have to say that that nobody knows the answer to that. The only person who can answer that question definitively is Donald Trump, and he's not telling anyone, and he may not have answered it in his own mind. But there are those. I think that of the three options that you mentioned, the one that is least likely is overthrow the regime. Because while some people might fantasize about that when they go to sleep at night, it's I think pretty much in the ethos of Donald Trump that the days of regime change policy of the United States are over.
Okay.
And I mean, I would imagine, I personally, I don't know what anyone in the administration is thinking, but I personally am very much aware of the fact that a lot of people were predicting that Assad was going to fall, and the Russians stepped in and propped him up. The Russians and the Iranians, right? There are too many interests of the Russians and the Chinese that are bound up with the Iranian regime. I think if the Iranian regime was about to fall, people would step in to prop it up, or at least we have to keep that idea. We have to have a little bit of imagination and realize that that's a real possibility. So in order to make it happen, the United States would have to be on the ground, and that's not going to happen. So I think the real debate is between those who would take a deal along the lines of what the State Department was negotiating with the Europeans at the beginning of the administration. That is a narrow deal on fixing the JCPOA, versus those that are more concerned about Iranian power in general. Personally, I don't think it's ever going to become real, because I don't think the Iranians are ever going to sit down and offer on any of the files a deal that would be acceptable to the administration. So,
one last question to you. So we see that there is a convergence of interest between US and some of the regional allies, at least Israel and Saudi Arabia, in regards to Iran,
right.
And a divergence of interest with the European allies. Do you think it would create a problem for US foreign policy? And do you think, is there any way to create a convergence of those different interests to what you said, to contain Iran?
I think it is a problem for U.S. foreign policy, and that there's this dissonance. When we've never seen the Europeans be quite so unified in their opposition to an American policy, at least rhetorically, and as openly defiant. But in terms of what they can do practically, it doesn't amount to a lot. But I don't think that, if we can call it symbolic opposition, is meaningless. I think it has a lot of effects. In terms of the effect it has on the Iranians, the effect it has on American diplomats. I mean, foreign policy is a social activity,
of course,
right? and the party to which the Americans are, our diplomats are engaged with, are going to most of the time, is a European party. And they don't like to be the guy, in the corner of the room that nobody wants to talk to. So it has an effect. I'm being facetious, but there's some truth. There's some truth to it. But the fact of the matter is that the Europeans can't do anything about European companies, the European private sector, leaving the Iranian market. And they don't have an answer to the rise of Iranian power on the ground. I mean, that's what's really striking, is the Europeans, for the most part, with some small exceptions, they're really not players in the military game on the ground. And there is a military game.
Sure.
And it's very easy for a lot of people who aren't engaged in the military game to pretend that the Iranian hand isn't all that strong behind Hezbollah or behind the Houthis in Yemen or with the militias on the ground. But those who are engaged in it know that it is. And the Europeans have no answer to that.
Thank you very much. Kadir, how about the Turkey's perspective?
Thank you, Kılıç. I think what Mike said about Trump's policy, that it has to be in one way or another the reverse of Obama policy, I think that is a helpful framework to a large extent, because I think we may end up in a similar place, a deal perhaps broader than JCPOA, but it has to be Trump. Trump has to be able to run away with it, saying, this is a deal I got, it's much better than what Obama got, and this is my deal. How do we get there? As you said, I think nobody knows. And in the meantime, we just have to hurt them hard, and then they'll have to come to the table. I think that's how he's looking at it. Obviously, this is not necessarily a, well planned out, thorough policy necessarily. But there are stark differences between the Obama administration's policy and Trump's policy. And from Turkey's perspective, Obama's policy had serious problems. Doing the reverse of it is going to have some serious problems as well. So one of the biggest problems with Obama's policy was that it was meant to be on the nuclear deal, but soon afterwards there was a bit too much talk about Iran being accepted in the region, and then there was a period, maybe a year, 2 years, regional powers, including Turkey and others, felt like, what's happening? Iran is everywhere, it's becoming too powerful, like this wasn't what it was supposed to be. Turkey's position on the nuclear issue remains the same. They do want some sort of agreement, they do support JCPOA, they oppose the cancellation, US pull out of it. But as you mentioned, there are things, it's limited what Turkey can do on that front. It can act as an actor that tries to find middle ground, and it has tried that in the past. But when US imposed sanctions, Turkey's oil was about 50% coming from Iran, and it was a big deal. They really needed the waivers. But this time around, I think there's been quite a bit of a tapering off of oil purchases from Iran. So latest number I heard was below 10%. It means, although they oppose these end of waivers, oil sanctions, they have also prepared for the day that sanctions wouldn't be waived. But that's a practical approach from Turkish side, because they don't want the economy, which is going through a bit of a difficult time, to have extra pressure coming from sanctions as well. On the other hand, we also saw Trump administration announce IRGC as a terror organization. And so far what they've done, like you said, Mike, there are bits and pieces of pressure, applying pressure. Can we call it a campaign? I don't know, but it is there. But the IRGC designation, among others, and then there's the rhetorical back and forth about the Strait of Hormuz, how that's going to play out is important, I think. Will it remain rhetorical, or are we going to see some sort of serious escalation on the ground in military terms, like you said? And is it going to get to a point where it cannot be managed anymore? Again, I want to agree with you on Trump's, I don't think he wants to go to war with Iran. I don't think he wants regime change in Iran. But the things he put in place, IRGC, sanctions, if these go out of control, I don't know how he'll be able to manage it heading into elections in 2020. But as I said, I agree that he does want a deal, and it has to be Trump-Iran deal. We saw that in North Korea as well. He didn't concern himself too much with how the deal looked like, but he could call it, it's my deal. That is important, we need to consider. And then regional dynamics are shaping up in an interesting way, of course. There is a strong sort of alliance with the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and UAE, Trump administration. But the way Trump looks at them and treats them, I don't know how sustainable that's going to be as well. Trump administration asking them for, they asked them to decrease the oil production, was it last year at some point? And then now they need to increase it. Then they have to pay for XYZ. How far that relationship is going to go towards a full sort of agreement on regional issues, because that's going to be complicated. And the current pressures that administration wants to impose on Iran is supported by Saudi Arabia and UAE. In the short to medium term, I think that's going to continue. But when the time comes, when Trump wants a deal, then what's going to happen to that dynamic? I'm kind of curious about that. But I think any deal would have to come in a second-term Trump presidency. I don't see that happening over the next year. Let me stop there then. Let me stop there, Kılıç.
A question, since the Tehran Declaration and between Turkey, Iran, and Brazil in 2010, we had this divergence of positions between the United States and Turkey. And what we see, and in different ways, even when President Obama was doing the JCPOA, Turkey had some concerns about Iran's regional policies. And President Trump became president, and Turkey didn't join the meeting in Riyadh and didn't join the meeting in Poland about Iran.
Yes.
So what would be the balance of, in Turkish foreign policy in regards to crisis between Iran and United States?
I actually, the reason I said let me stop here, I didn't want to go that far in saying actually we may come back to where Turkey was in terms of trying to negotiate a solution between the two countries. Because if what Mike said happens and there's a containment policy, there won't be many powers that can find a middle ground. Europe, of course, can be instrumental, but I think Turkey will definitely want to play that role. On the one hand, Iran, they don't want Iran to dominate the game, let's say, in Syria and Iraq. And it is a real concern how far they've been able to have an impact on the ground. But at the same time, they are still reliant on energy prices. Even if they're not buying from Iran, ups and downs on the oil markets, energy markets, is a serious concern. So any kind of regional instability impacts Turkey's economy, Turkey's relationship with Iran and what it can do on Syria, for instance, Iraq too. Turkey has a good relationship with KRG, but they get caught between U.S. and Iran as well. So this may be far out, Kılıç, but I do see Turkey being able to work out some of the recent issues we discussed here, like S-400s and PYD in northern Iraq. If there is, I think Trump does want to work with Turkey overall at the end of the day. And you might see a role for Turkey in the U.S.-Iran conversation. I don't see they're going to go out there, sign anything like that, like it happened in 2010, because Turkey was part of the UN Security Council. Sorry, you also mentioned Turkey not being part of the conferences that were clearly anti-Iran. I think that the things I just said explain that Turkey wants some sort of agreement at some point so that we can get regional stability.
Thank you very much. Ali, and your perspective, and is there any solutions? Do you think there will be any middle ground for this?
Thank you very much, Khalid. It's great to be at SETA. I thought the question you put to Mike for reading the president's mind was the most difficult question. But coming up with solutions in this case is also quite hard, if not harder. To be honest with you, first of all, I don't think that it's likely that we would see negotiations between Iran and the US in the next year and a half. Mm-hmm. First of all, this is because from the Iranian perspective, the elections in the US are very close, very near. So it's not worth the political risk of engaging an administration that might not be in office in the short term, right? Also, I think the Trump administration has rendered itself almost radioactive in Tehran in the sense that it has used the kind of rhetoric and language about the Iranian leadership that renders the political cost of engagement with the Trump administration really prohibitive for any Iranian leader, more particularly President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, who have already paid a huge political price for the JCPOA, which has ended in grief, basically. Now, I think things would change after November 2020, depending on the outcome. If there is Trump 2.0, counterintuitively, the Iranians might consider him in a better situation to actually offer them something meaningful. It will be his last term. He wouldn't be too concerned about his base. And, he's been in office for first term, so he knows the ropes pretty well, and he might be able to deliver. If there is a democratic president, I think the expectation on the Iranian side is that the US would re-enter the JCPOA unconditionally. Now, we can discuss whether that's realistic or not, but that's their expectation. And then potentially there could be discussions about a broader, better deal that could be built on the JCPOA as the basis, right? So that's the idea. The trouble that I see also in the case of getting back to the negotiating table is if you look at Iranian behavior, there is a very clear pattern of how they would like to negotiate. In fact, Ayatollah Khamenei, Supreme Leader of Iran, has been pretty clear in explaining when he decided to go back to a negotiating table with the Obama administration. And he clearly explains that this happened when Iran had a strong hand, and he goes through a list. He says, we had 10,000 kilograms of enriched uranium, we had 20,000 centrifuges, we had a bunkered Fordo facility, we had the heavy water reactor in Iraq. So he goes through the list, and he said, we had a strong hand. I would argue, in addition to that, there were two other elements that were really fundamental to the negotiations in 2012-13 becoming serious, which was the fact that President Obama took regime change off the table. Officially sent a letter to the Supreme Leader and took that off the table. It's a very different proposition than an administration that is hinting at regime change almost on a weekly basis, right? Without actually uttering the words, but everything it says, it really amounts to that. And the second thing President Obama did, of course, was that he made the first concession to the Iranians in Oman. He accepted that zero enrichment was just a maximalist and unrealistic goal, and he signaled to the Iranians that he's prepared to accept a limited and rigorously monitored enrichment program on Iranian soil, and that's what basically broke the ice between the two sides. Now, there is this, I think, misguided notion in this city, which has congealed almost into a doctrine, which is that Iran doesn't respond to pressure, but it responds to massive pressure. So the more you dial up the pressure, the likelier that the Iranians would negotiate, which, again, doesn't take into account this pattern. And also, I think the historic analogies that are used are inaccurate. You often hear people talk about the 1988 drinking of the poison chalice by the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini at the time, which ended the Iran-Iraq War, not realizing that in fact, that decision stabilized the Islamic Republic. It guaranteed its survival. It didn't threaten it, right? And also that Iran, at the end of the day, agreed to ceasefire with Iraq at the time that it didn't lose an inch of its territory. So it wasn't a losing scenario for the Iranians in any way. Or take 2003 when the Iranians offered a grand bargain to the US. This was after the US obviously had invaded their neighbor to the east in Afghanistan and then their neighbor to the west in Iraq in a matter of few weeks. Well, if you look at the text of the proposal, it's a proposal to negotiate. Is not a unilateral concession in any way. So there are, again, these issues, I think there are misunderstandings about them. And I would argue the one thing that the Iranians consider more dangerous than suffering from sanctions is surrendering to them. And so I would say if we are really thinking about serious negotiations, there are a few things that need to happen. Now, there seems to be a clear divide between the president and his national security team in terms of the final objectives that they're seeking. I would argue it's almost ludicrous to believe that John Bolton and Secretary Pompeo actually want a win-win solution with the Iranians. So I think the president will have to basically appoint either an Iran envoy, a representative for Iran, who has a good working relationship with the Iranians. There are diplomats in this country who have negotiated with the Iranians in the past. Take Ryan Crocker, I don't know, even take Zalmay Khalilzad, take Tom Pickering. Well, I mean, I'm talking about people who this administration would be a bit more comfortable with, but would also have a good working relationship with the Iranians. This would signal, right? For sure. This would signal to the Iranians that the president is prepared to go around his hawkish national security team. And second, I think the president will also have to step aside from these maximalist demands and signal in some way that he's willing to accept something that is much less than the 12 conditions that Secretary Pompeo has outlined. My fear is the Iranians would at some stage reach the conclusion that there is no way other than negotiations. But again, in order to do so, they would have to escalate before they can de-escalate, which means that they would have to restart their nuclear program in order to reaccumulate leverage, which means that we have to go through a nuclear crisis before we get back to the negotiating table. And with this national security team in the White House, that means war.
The 12, you mentioned while closing your remarks, the 12 demands of the US administration. And when we put it in a context, it was 4 different issues. One was the nuclear issue. Second one was the Iranian regional policies. Third one was the US citizens arrested in Iran. And the fourth one was not threaten the other regional actors in Iran. Missiles, the conventional missiles, and which would be a threat to the other countries in the region. Which would be, do you think, the realistic scenario? You know, like the not 4 all of those, but maybe 2. Which one of those?
So first notice that there's nothing on human rights and democracy added later on. In the 12 conditions, there's nothing about those issues. So you see where the interest lies. Look, the Iranian foreign minister, when he was in New York last week, he basically brought up this issue of prisoner swap, which seems to be the lowest hanging fruit. But I would argue the objective of that proposal was not because he believed that the prisoner swap is realistic. In fact, this has been proposed to the Trump administration at least as of 6 months ago, and the answer has been negative. And I would argue as we get closer to the elections here, the chances of the administration engaging in a prisoner swap, which would be quite controversial with the Iranians, is not very high. When it gets to the nuclear issue, I would argue the experience of the JCPOA itself showed that both sides were, to a certain extent, unsatisfied with the terms of the deal, right? The Iranians were also unhappy with sanctions relief that they got even under the Obama administration. So there was always this argument that you could have a more for more or a better for better arrangement based on the JCPOA, maybe some longer term limits, shorter term timelines for access to suspect sites. These, I think, could have been possible if additional sanctions relief would have been offered. But now that the president has withdrawn from the deal, I think it's very difficult to trust that this administration would be reliable. But on the ballistic missile side and on the regional side, I would argue the major misconception, again, in this city is that people don't realize that the nuclear issue, at least as of 2003, was no longer a core national security issue for the Iranians. So they could give it away in return for economic incentives. That's not the case with the ballistic missile program and the regional issue. So you can't trade that with purely economic incentive. You need to provide the Iranians with security assurances.
Yeah.
And take the case of North Korea and see how far we can go in offering security assurances that are believable and viable for the other side.
Thank you. If there are any questions from the audience, let me collect them. Otherwise, I have some questions myself. Yes.
Thank you for the great panel. Begum Mazarsus from Voice of America Turkey Service. My question would be maybe for Mark or for Ali Faiz or you.
To everybody. Okay.
To everybody. Sorry, Begum Doğmaz from Voice of America Turkish Service. The Trump administration decided not to extend the waivers to the 8 countries, including Turkey. And Turkey says, at least the presidential spokesperson Ibrahim Kalın says Turkey has been looking at some different mechanisms to bypass the Iranian sanctions. And we know that in the past, this caused some trouble for Turkey, using the methods to bypass the Iranian sanctions, the case of Halkbank and everything. And this is apparently one of the issues that divides US and Turkey, apart from the other challenging issues such as S-400 and Syria. So if Turkey decides to challenge the Iranian sanctions and go with a similar mechanism like the Europeans are trying to establish, what sort of a position that would put Turkey?
Mike, you want to start?
I can speculate. I'd be curious to hear our Turkish colleagues answer that question as well. But I would start with the observation that I think the real game at the moment for the Turks is the question of Syria, the border zone that they're negotiating with the Americans. I mean, that's the #1 issue.
Safe zone.
Safe zone. Sorry, the safe zone, and then the S-400s, and everything else. I think is kind of window dressing to that negotiation. And my impression is that the administration is very much interested in making it as easy as possible for the Turks to do as much as possible with regard to the Iranian energy imports. So I would expect that there would be a deal to be had. I mean, part of the debate between the State Department and the White House about this issue of waivers is that the State Department position would be that so long as the countries that are importing Iranian oil are showing a good faith effort not to to reduce it, and they are actually reducing the imports, then we can find creative solutions. And so I think the spirit in the White House about that and the good faith that the Turks have shown in it would mean that it's not really going to be the major issue. The real issues are the safe zone and the S-400s.
Barbara, do you want to add anything?
I'm not an authority on
Okay.
what Turkey
But-
would accept, so I defer
Kadir.
to
Well,
Kadir.
I think last time around, one of the differences, important differences, was I mentioned earlier, Turkey was much more reliant on the Iran oil. Also, in terms of uranium enrichment, Turkey had a sort of principled position on the nuclear issue. They didn't want that that right to be NPT, let's say, to be damaged. So they looked more principled and being on the side of Iran on that dispute, because also they had signed a paper, 2010 Tehran Declaration, saying, look, we have a way out here, we have a solution, and U.S. declining, back then Secretary of State Clinton had worked out a deal with the other permanent members of the UN. He was ready to go, and she didn't accept that deal. So the context is very different in terms of Turkey's approach to the nuclear deal. Back then, basically, Turkey refused to recognize the sanctions and said, we are going to trade, we are reliant on them. We had a deal, you guys didn't agree with it. Okay, we are going to go forward with this, and then payments will have to be figured out one way or another. And then Halkbank had, Iran had an account at Halkbank, etc., to facilitate payments. So I think we are at a different context right now. The JCPOA, US pulled out, but technically it's in place. Europe is coordinating, and Turkey agrees with that agreement, continuation of that agreement. And then on the oil sanctions, as I said, it has tapered its buys already to avoid the detrimental impact of the sanctions. So we are at both Trump and Turkey want to work together despite these serious sort of S-400 and YPG issues. So I think it's a very different context.
Thank you. Barbara, I have a question. What is the alternative? You criticize the current position of the US administration. What would be the alternative way to resolve this issue?
Well, I think
If you think there is an issue.
I'm not sure I have much confidence in the ability of this administration as presently constituted to negotiate anything, certainly not with Iran. But, ideally, if you look at the sort of North Korea model, you have the maximum pressure and then you have a negotiating process. I would agree with Ali that I don't think the current personnel are well suited to that. You would need to name someone who has had experience with Iran and who has not been on the record calling for regime change, as John Bolton did when he taunted, the supreme leader of the country and said, go ahead and celebrate your 40th anniversary, you won't be there much longer. I mean, that's not a basis for negotiation. So, conceivably, and we've seen that President Trump has made efforts to meet President Rouhani. If they were to make some preparation for that, I'm not sure it could happen this September, but maybe the following September, but there would have to be some preparation. You can't do it by the seat of the pants. Javad Zarif has often said that, we're not going to trade 150 pages, which is the JCPOA, for a photo op in 2 pages, referring to what Trump got out of his summit in Singapore with Kim Jong-un. And we've seen how that has already fallen apart, apparently, and certainly they haven't been able to build on it. So ideally, you would have a discussion, and perhaps Turkey or another country, Oman or Qatar, somebody could act as a mediator, the Europeans, and begin to talk about some realistic parameters for a JCPOA 2.0 that might perhaps come in a second Trump term if Trump is reelected. And you could have some understandings. I mean, by then, let's face it, Assad has already, quote unquote, won. So one could see Iran begin to withdraw from Syria, would not need the same kind of presence of Shia militias there. Ideally, Iraq would be more stable. I don't know if that's in the cards, but again, you could see a reduction in Iranian presence there. And you could see a real concerted effort to get the Yemen war done, which is serving nobody's purposes, frankly, except perhaps Iran, because Saudi Arabia is bogged down there. You'd see some real diplomacy, but for that you need real diplomats. You know, we don't even have a UN ambassador. The Iranians have just sent a very experienced diplomat, Majid Takht Ravanchi, to New York. He was one of the negotiators of the JCPOA. He was a deputy foreign minister, very experienced man, and we have no one. I think the person who's been named as another Fox News commentator of some sort or anchor. I mean, put a serious person in New York who can actually meet with Ravanchi and begin to lay the groundwork or set up some sort of special envoy procedure. And you know, and then maybe we could get a better deal for both sides. But if it's just going to be the way it is now, I mean, every day the State Department puts out something criticizing Iran, you know, and usually the reasons are quite legitimate, some human rights atrocity that has taken place. But Iran, we don't see the same kind of comments on Saudi Arabia or North Korea or any other country. And what is the purpose of this? Just to make the Iranians angry so that there never will be negotiations? Maybe that's what John Bolton wants. But I think really it's hard to imagine, anything going forward as long as Bolton is there. You know, Pompeo maybe, but Bolton, I just don't see it.
Do you want to add something to that, Mike?
Maybe just my thought about what I think the heart of the conflict is, or not the conflict, but the heart of the issue for the Iranians. Mm-hmm. The Iranians got something extremely valuable from the JCPOA, and that is, as Ali said, it's the concession that Obama made in order to bring them to the table. And that was a right to enrichment combined with the sunsets for all of the restrictions. They haven't lost either of those yet. And for all that we say that the Trump administration has left the deal, it's continuing to give waivers for civil nuclear
Can I
activity.
interrupt you on that just 1 second?
Can I finish my point first?
Let him finish.
Just
then
on the waivers for the
happy to-
nuclear stuff.
I'm
Let him finish and then I will give you.
happy to argue with you, but let me get my point out. These are two extremely valuable things to them, and they will suffer a lot before they will give that up. And the Trump administration hasn't taken either away. Mm-hmm. It has said it wants to get rid of the sunsets, but it hasn't.
Do you think the priority will be the sunsets?
I think the priority for that has to be one of the priorities. I mean, Trump enunciated at the beginning of the administration 4 issues: ballistic missiles, sunsets, inspections, and regional regional activities. So I think that sunsets has to be there, but they haven't taken civil nuclear away. Actually, the administration. And the Iranians are very much aware that they still hold on to that. That is the jewel in the crown for them. So exactly how that plays out, I don't know. But I think that from the Iranian side, that has got to be the heart of the issue.
Barbara?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I agree with you on the sunsets, and I think that's a very important part of a JCPOA 2.0, but I wanted to take exception. There's been a kerfuffle in the Twitterverse over these civil nuclear waivers, but in fact, apparently almost nothing has been done in terms of Chinese redesign or British redesign, so they're really kind of empty promises. And the Iranians will most likely have to come up with their own solution for Arak and so on. This would not be such a big deal if those waivers were removed. So that's kind of a red herring in Twitterland.
It's a big deal in that it betrays a certain American mindset. It's when I drew the distinction between maximum pressure versus revise the deal. There are lots of elements within the administration, and certainly within Europe, that are looking to revise the deal. So if the Trump administration moved to end the civil nuclear, whatever the practical effect of the waivers for civil nuclear activity, they exist, and that was a very important concession to the Europeans and to the Iranians, and the Iranians recognize that.
Ali?
One point here. I think if you look at what Mike is talking about in terms of tensions within the administration between those who want to kill the deal and those who think that preserving it would allow the U.S. to have its cake and eat it too, I think the former is gaining the upper hand. Some of the recent moves that we've seen by the administration clearly signals that basically the group who wants to kill the deal is now having the upper hand, because for them the clock is ticking, and the deadline, I think, is not just the 2020 elections here, but also the fact that in October of 2020 the UN arms embargo on Iran will be lifted according to the JCPOA's calendar.
Right.
And that would allow Iran for the first time in many, many years to buy advanced, sophisticated conventional weapons. And imagine if Iran decides to break out of the nuclear deal after October 2020, after it had made purchases from Russia and China legally on the international market. And I think that's a major fear to someone like Bolton. It's a major concern to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, to the UAE. So I think they're doubling down to make sure that they kill the deal before we reach that milestone. That's why they're doing a lot of unprecedented, brazen things, because otherwise what Mike is talking about in terms of maximum pressure is just not going to materialize. As long as Iran is in the deal, as long as the US is isolated internationally on this particular issue, even if, by the way, oil sanctions work effectively. Remember, we were talking about 100,000 barrels of Iran's oil exports to Turkey, which amounts to $6 million per day, almost $6.5 million per day. The trade between the two countries is around 15 billion. Majority of that, by the way, is non-oil trade. Iran has a lot of trade with Afghanistan, has a lot of trade with Iraq. This is a big country. This is not an island like North Korea, right? It's basically, it has 15 neighbors through land and sea. Imposing an absolute embargo on it is almost an impossible task. But I feel that the administration, after a year of maximum pressure, is coming to the conclusion that, yeah, if you look at the results, if you go on the State Department's maximum pressure page, the results that they show as number of entities and individuals that they've sanctioned, how much this has cost Iran, but these are not the results that the administration was seeking. The administration was seeking change in behavior in the region. There's no sign of it whatsoever. And if you see less money for Hezbollah is not necessarily a function of Iran sanctions. It's also a function of realities on the ground. If you look at Iran's preparedness to come back to a negotiating table and surrender, there's no sign of it. There is no existential threat to the system on the streets in Iran. Basically, I would argue even last year we had more protests that were threatening to the system than we have this year. So maximum pressure is not producing the results, and I think that's why the administration is getting more and more frustrated and doubling down.
Thank you. Let's get a question and then.
Thank you. I'd like you to all of you to refocus on the issue of maximum pressure, because it's a nice rhetorical construct, but in the end, how maximum is the pressure now, and how much can the United States really increase the pressure? You have all mentioned factors that make it difficult for the United States to go much further. Nobody has mentioned the fear of a spike in oil prices. That's very much on Trump's mind. He's putting pressure on Saudi Arabia. I don't know if that is enough and so on. So can the administration really increase the pressure, given the fact that it has, so far, there is not much to show for it? Can it increase it even more? Can this pressure really become maximum pressure?
Shall we start with Kadir and then yeah.
Actually, when Ali was talking, I was thinking about that as well. You're right, Ali. Like it's hard to point out many concrete results, let's say, in terms of policy, but it's at the same time not that costly for the U.S. administration to impose these. And it took Trump several rounds, right, to be able to pull out of JCPOA. If it were up to him, he would have got out of it much sooner. And then now he's designating IRGC. He's aiming for zero oil exports. I think these are not simple things for Iran, and it's not maximum pressure campaign. Can we contain them fully? I think that Ali is right about that. It's going to be very, very difficult to contain it, especially if you don't have the international community with you. They're arguing with you about that. But that doesn't mean the pressure campaign is going to make things very hard for Iran. And I think it's not that costly for Trump either. And he can keep slapping sanctions going forward without necessarily producing the policy result that you're mentioning, Ali. So I agree with him that, you know, this will, if it gets to a agreement, it's going to have to be in the second administration of Trump, if there was one. And I wanted to also say something about the, you know, people who's negotiating, who's not. I mean, when you look at his campaign on immigration, he has Steve Miller. When you look at his China negotiations, you have Leitziger. So he does have a way of kind of sending the, let's say, hardliners or hawks on an issue, because he wants ultimately to say, I pressured them and then here's the deal I got. He wants to be the one who gets that deal done. He doesn't want that to be done by, let's say, you know, the kind of negotiators you mentioned. I think it's going to be critical to understand how he approaches this. He wants to get a deal, but it has to be in his own terms, however he defines it and sells it to the public. But in the meantime, he's happy just keep applying pressure without necessarily resulting in a comprehensive policy solution. So I think we're gonna see that over the next at least a year and a half, 2 years.
So I don't disagree with what Kadir just said, but this is precisely where the risk lies in this policy, because it's not sustainable in the long run. I mean, the Iranians are now demonstrating restraint. They're sitting on their hands. They have the strategic patience policy because they thought that it's better to have the rest of the international community on their side based on the previous experience of the sanctions regime, that maybe this way they would be able to neutralize US sanctions. Well, guess what? It hasn't worked. Right? So they have less and less to lose. And therefore, I think they have more and more interest in imposing a cost on US policy, because otherwise they think the US would just continue ratcheting up pressure. Now, how are they going to do it? There are obviously two ways. One is in the nuclear realm, as Barbara mentioned. And I think potentially they can either decide that they want to start violating some elements of the JCPOA as a way of signaling. For example, if next month the IAEA comes out, actually this month in a few weeks, and says that heavy water production in Iran has surpassed the threshold. This is not taking Iran any closer to nuclear weapons necessarily if we have a ton extra production of heavy water, but it's a signal which is important, and it might the Iranians might do it in the hope that they would push the Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese to do more for them. But there's also the possibility that they might get out of the JCPOA at some stage, or even get out of the NPT as they have started signaling. But I still think the nuclear realm is not the likeliest place where we will see escalation. It's the likeliest places in the region where they have a strong hand and a lot of options for imposing a cost on the US and its allies. I mean, when the Iranians, in response to the oil sanctions, people often think that the Iranians might shut down the Strait of Hormuz. I don't think that would ever happen. The biggest risk is in the Red Sea, is in Bab el-Mandab, where potentially the Houthis could start targeting Saudi and Emirati oil shipments to Europe. In fact, the Iranians have started talking about this publicly. And that worries me because the retaliation would not necessarily come against the Houthis, it might come against Iran. And that would start a cycle of escalation. Same thing in Iraq, your field of expertise. It might very well be the case that the Iranians would decide to go after US Special Forces there. There's always some plausible deniability, but there are also serious risks. When this happened in September of last year, Bolton wanted to use it as a pretext for striking Iran. At the time, General Mattis was there, and he basically stopped the effort. Now Mattis is not there anymore, right? In fact, we don't have a Secretary of Defense the same way. So the risks are really, really high.
Barbara, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just in the sense of what more could this administration do? I think they've really shot their wad pretty much with this oil, ending the oil waivers. I mean, what else could we do? Have a complete embargo, encircle the whole country? That's impossible, especially with all the land borders that Iran has and the amount of smuggling that already goes on and is likely to increase. So this is if this doesn't work, I mean, I don't know what the administration can do to further ratchet up pressure. I'm frightened to think. I don't know. Maybe Mike has some ideas. He's been on the NSC, so.
I have lots of ideas, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, kill, assassinate Qasem Soleimani.
That wouldn't be a bad idea. I see it more like Kadir does. I mean, I don't, Barbara, your assumption, and Ali, your assumption is that where the administration is looking for some kind of solution to this, some kind of negotiated solution with the Iranians.
No, I don't actually believe that.
I don't believe they are. No. And I think that they are more inclined to see themselves in a geostrategic competition with Iran that's not easy to end. If it's going to be ended, it's going to be ended because the Iranians are going to come forward and make some proposals that are acceptable to the administration. I don't see that happening. One of the things that the Obama administration did, which was superpower malpractice, was to take military deterrence off the table. We signaled under the Obama administration time and time again that when Iran crossed our red lines, we would not consider military action. Trump has gone some way toward reconstituting the deterrent threat. I mean, for example, attacking Assad for his use of chemical weapons, and attacking the Russians and the Iranian irregulars, quote unquote irregulars, that were trying to take the oil in Deir ez-Zor last February, I believe it was, and so on. So if the Iranians want to start a game of military escalation, even if it's through a hidden hand in the region, I think that they would be wise to think twice about that, because the United States can win the game of military escalation with Iran. I have no doubt about that. I don't think it wants to do that at all, but I think it has a strong interest in showing the Iranians that if that's the card they're going to play, then we can win at that game too. With regard to maximum economic pressure, there's more areas where we can put economic pressure on them. We have basically given Hezbollah in Lebanon, with its economic activities, a pass. The banking system, the Lebanese banking system, and Hezbollah's use of it has basically been off limits for Treasury sanctions. There are a couple, but they're really very minor and symbolic. There's also a lot of Iranian activities in Iraq that the United States is turning a blind eye to. And America has proxies as well, such as the Israelis, who are actually carrying out military campaign against Iranians on the ground in Syria. So if it's a game of escalation, however they want to play it, there are lots of levers the United States can pull. So I see continuing competition, and exactly as Kadir said, it comes at a relatively low cost to Donald Trump.
You want to say
Yeah,
something? I guess.
I don't think that, given our record in the Middle East, that we should be bragging about our ability to use the military effectively or to escalate the military card in the region. I mean, there we are still bogged down, and it's 18 years now coming on since 9/11, and what do we have to show for it? So we have an Iran that is much more influential than it was in 2001, much more influential in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon. If you start trying to crash the Lebanese banking system, you can have another failed state. We're in a place where Hezbollah is by far the strongest military power, so you will destroy what's left of the non-Hezbollah elements of Lebanon, and thereby continuing the glorious American record of mistakes in the Middle East. So I'm not so confident that this is a game that the U.S. can quote-unquote win. And that's why Obama changed the policy and decided that you could not ignore a country of 80 million people that had been important for thousands of years, and that it might make some sense to try to talk to these people and begin to accommodate some of their concerns if you wanted to stabilize the region.
Can I?
Sure.
I didn't brag about American military power. You and Ali made an argument.
You said we could win the game of military escalation, quote unquote.
Can I finish my point? You and Ali made the point that the Iranians, in essence, don't feel pain, and that pain, putting hurt on the Iranians, has no.
We said it all.
Well, this is how I understood. This is how I understood it. That the policy of putting hurt on the Iranians, economic, military, whatever, is inherently counterproductive. I believe that the Iranians are very good at putting a public face on the fact that they appearing in public as if they don't feel pain when they feel it actually quite intensely. You and Ali suggested that the Iranians are going to escalate if the United States continues its economic pressure, and I'm saying they may well do that, but the United States has tools to escalate as well. And this administration, unlike the previous one, is quite willing to use those tools. Now, I'm no more bragging about that than you're bragging about the prowess of Hezbollah when you say that it's so powerful and that it will happily bring down the system in Lebanon. You've got 12 million people displaced in Syria. You've got 1 million killed, most of them at the hands of the people who you are defending.
Not defending them, I'm simply stating facts.
Yeah. On that note, we will complete our panel now. Please join me thanking our panelists, and thank you for coming to the event.
Thank you.